The dying Cherokee woman collapsed in his yard, her skeletal daughter clinging to her side, and whispered the words that would change everything. "Save my daughter. Let me go." Mason stood in his empty barn, staring at 3 sacks of grain. All that separated him from starvation. 3 months of carefully calculated survival. The mathematics were brutal and simple. He barely had enough to save himself. Taking in a dying woman was suicide. Taking in a child was madness. But he walked back to that house and said the most irrational thing he'd ever spoken. "No, I'll save both of you." Some choices defy logic. Some acts of mercy border on insanity. This was both, and it would test whether compassion could outlast calculation. Mason Brooks stood in his empty barn, staring at the 3 remaining sacks of grain, all that stood between him and total ruin. The Texas drought had entered its 3rd brutal year, turning his once modest ranch into a graveyard of dead grass and dust. 20 head of cattle had dwindled to 4. His vegetable garden was a field of withered stalks. The creek that had never run dry in living memory was now just cracked mud. He was 32 years old and facing the very real possibility of starvation. The November wind rattled the barn doors, carrying the scent of dust and desperation. Mason ran his calloused hands over his face, feeling the hollowness in his own cheeks. He'd already sold everything of value: his father's pocket watch, his mother's silver, even his spare saddle. The bank had given him until spring to make payment on the land, or they'd foreclose. His stomach growled, reminding him he'd eaten only cornmeal mush for the past 4 days. The grain in those sacks had to last through winter, had to feed him and the remaining cattle, had to be rationed with mathematical precision if he wanted to see spring. Mason pulled out a small notebook where he'd been tracking supplies. 3 sacks. Approximately 90 pounds total. If he was careful, painfully, miserably careful, he might make it to March, when he could sell the cattle and buy passage somewhere else, start over, admit defeat. The sound of footsteps outside made him look up. Probably his neighbor, old Henry Walsh, coming to offer another lecture about accepting reality and moving back east. But when Mason stepped outside, he froze. A Cherokee woman stood in his yard, swaying on her feet like a tree about to fall. She was skeletal thin, her traditional dress hanging loose on a frame that seemed held together by will alone. Her face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over prominent bones, dark eyes sunken deep. But what made Mason's breath catch was the small child clinging to her side, a girl no more than 7, equally emaciated, with enormous frightened eyes. The woman took 1 step forward and collapsed. Mason rushed forward, catching the woman before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing, like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth. The little girl cried out, grabbing at her mother with desperate hands. "Mama, Mama, wake up." "Easy, easy," Mason said, lifting the woman carefully. "Let's get her inside." He carried her into his house, a modest 2-room structure that had seen better days. The girl followed, never releasing her grip on her mother's dress. Mason laid the woman on his bed, the only bed in the house, and grabbed a cup of water from his dwindling supply. The woman's eyes fluttered open as he helped her drink. She choked, coughed, then drank greedily. When the cup was empty, she looked at him with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like dried leaves. "My name is Aria. This is Hazel." She touched the girl's head with a trembling hand. "We've been walking for 3 days. From where?" "The territory. My husband's family." She closed her eyes. "They didn't want us. After he died, they said I brought bad spirits, sent us away." She coughed again, a rattling sound that made Mason's chest tighten. "I tried to reach the mission in Gainesville, but Her hand went to her chest. "I'm sick, very sick. I won't make it." The little girl, Hazel, began to cry quietly, as if she'd heard this before and knew it was true. Arya's eyes fixed on Mason with desperate clarity. "I don't ask you to save me. I'm already dying. But please." Her hand gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "Save my daughter. Take her. Feed her. Keep her alive. I'm begging you." Tears streamed down her hollow cheeks. "Let me die knowing she'll live." Mason looked at the child, thin as a rail, ribs visible through her worn dress but alive, then at Arya, whose labored breathing and feverish eyes told him she was likely right about her condition. His mind went to the barn. 3 sacks of grain, 90 pounds, carefully rationed to keep 1 man and 4 cattle alive until spring. "Please," Arya whispered. "I know you don't know us. I know you owe us nothing, but she's innocent. She's just a child. Let me go in peace, knowing someone showed her kindness in this cruel world." Mason stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at his dying ranch. Every calculation he'd made screamed the same truth. He barely had enough to save himself. Taking in a child would cut his rations in half. Taking in both of them would be suicide. He turned back to face them. "No." Arya's face crumpled. Hazel buried her face in her mother's side, sobbing. "I won't just save your daughter," Mason said quietly. "I'll save both of you." Arya stared at him as if she'd misheard. "What? You heard me?" Mason moved to his small pantry, pulling out a jar of preserved vegetables, one of his last. "I'm not letting a mother die while I keep her child, and I'm not letting a child watch her mother die if I can prevent it." "You don't understand." Arya tried to sit up, her voice urgent. "I'm dying. It's consumption. I've been sick for months. The fever, the cough." She dissolved into hacking that confirmed her words. "You'd waste food on someone already gone." "That's not your decision to make." Mason opened the jar, the smell of pickled carrots and onions making his own stomach clench with hunger. "You might die, probably will if I'm being honest, but you might not, and I won't play God by deciding who deserves a chance and who doesn't." He brought over a plate with the vegetables and a small piece of cornbread, his own dinner, uncooked yet. "Eat slowly. Your stomachs aren't used to food." "But you—" Arya looked at the meager portion, then at him. "This is your food. I've got food." A lie. He had grain. He'd figure something out. Hazel reached for the cornbread with trembling hands, looked at her mother for permission. Arya nodded, tears streaming down her face, and the child ate with heartbreaking desperation. "Why?" Arya whispered. "You're poor yourself. I can see it. This ranch is failing. You have nothing. Why would you share nothing with strangers?" Mason sat down heavily on his only chair. "My parents died of cholera when I was 10. No warning, just gone in 3 days. The neighbors could have taken me in, but times were hard. Everyone said they couldn't afford another mouth to feed." He looked at Hazel, who was chewing slowly, savoring every bite. "A Cherokee family traveling through found me half dead by the road. They were poor too, didn't speak much English, but they fed me, sheltered me, brought me to a town where I could be placed with a family." He met Arya's eyes. "They saved my life when it made no sense to do so. I've never forgotten that." "So this is repayment," Arya said softly. "No. This is what decent people do when they have a choice between selfish survival and impossible generosity." Mason stood. "Now rest. Both of you. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to make this work." As night fell, Mason lay on the floor wrapped in a thin blanket, listening to Arya's labored breathing and Hazel's quiet sniffles. He'd just divided his survival odds by 3. By every logical measure, he'd made a fatal mistake, but he'd also never slept more soundly in his life. The next 2 weeks tested every shred of Mason's resolve. He divided his grain rations into impossibly small portions, supplementing with whatever he could hunt or forage. A rabbit here, some late-season wild onions there. He walked the creek bed for hours, searching for anything edible. Arya grew worse before she grew better. The fever raged for days, and Mason sat up nights applying cool cloths to her forehead, forcing her to drink water, refusing to let her slip away. Hazel helped with quiet determination, fetching water and holding her mother's hand. "You should let me go," Arya whispered one night, delirious with fever. "Save the food. Save yourselves." "Not happening," Mason replied, spooning broth into her mouth, broth made from boiling bones he'd already boiled twice before. The cattle grew thin. Mason grew thinner. But slowly, impossibly, Arya began to improve. The fever broke. The coughing eased. Color returned to her cheeks in small increments. By the second week, she could sit up. By the third, she could walk to the table. And as she grew stronger, she began to help, cooking, cleaning, managing the meager supplies with an efficiency born of her own experience with poverty. "You're wasting away," she told Mason one morning, watching him prepare the day's rations. "You're giving us your portions. I'm bigger, I can handle it." "Mason." She placed her hand over his, stopping him. "What you're doing, it's killing you. The sacrifice is too much. Then we all make it together." He met her eyes. "That was the deal I made with myself. We all survive, or none of us do." Hazel, growing stronger each day, began helping with small chores. She fed the chickens the minuscule amounts of grain Mason allocated. She gathered kindling. She smiled, something Arya said she hadn't done in months. One evening, as they shared a meal of thin stew and cornbread so small it was almost symbolic, Hazel spoke. "Mr. Mason," she said quietly, "when Mama is all better, can we stay, help you with the ranch?" Mason looked at Arya, saw the hope and fear warring in her eyes. "If you want to," he said simply. Winter came hard and cruel, but they survived it together. Mason's careful rationing, combined with Arya's resourcefulness and fierce determination to contribute, stretched the impossible into the barely possible. She showed him Cherokee techniques for finding edible roots. She taught Hazel to make fish traps that actually worked. She mended clothes, made soap from ashes, and managed to make their scarce supplies go further than Mason had thought possible. By February, Arya had regained enough strength to work alongside Mason. By March, when the first green shoots appeared in the fields and the cattle prices rose enough to sell, they had become something neither expected, a family. Mason sold 2 of the 4 cattle, keeping a breeding pair. The money wasn't enough to save the ranch, but it was enough to buy seed and supplies, and with 3 people working instead of 1, there was hope. The day Henry Walsh stopped by and found Mason plowing fields with Arya and Hazel planting behind him, the old man just stared. "You took in strangers," Henry said flatly, "during a drought, when you were barely surviving yourself." "Yes, that's the damnedest fool thing I ever heard." Henry shook his head, then surprisingly he smiled. "It's also the most decent thing I've seen in 20 years. You need help getting that north field planted?" Word spread. Other neighbors, shamed or inspired by Mason's radical generosity, began to help. Not much, times were still hard, but enough. A day's labor here, a shared tool there. The community that had been fracturing under the weight of drought and hardship began to remember what it meant to be neighbors. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold, Arya spoke. "You could have died," she said quietly. "Probably should have. The food you gave us might have been the difference between your survival and death." "Might have been," Mason agreed, "but it was also the difference between being alive and actually living." Hazel, now healthy and growing, sat between them playing with a carved wooden horse Mason had made for her. She looked up at her mother, then at Mason. "Mama says you're an angel," she said seriously. "I'm just a man who made a choice." "The hardest choice," Arya corrected. She looked at him with eyes that held gratitude too deep for words. You chose compassion when logic demanded selfishness. You chose to save people you didn't know when saving yourself was barely possible. She paused. You gave us everything, when you had nothing to give. Mason looked out at his fields, at the small green shoots pushing through soil that had seemed dead, at the cattle grazing peacefully, at the house that was no longer empty but filled with voices and life. We saved each other, he said finally. That's how survival really works. Not by hoarding what little we have, but by sharing it and multiplying it through connection. You taught me that strength isn't about enduring alone. It's about having the courage to invite others into your struggle. Arya's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. Thank you, she whispered, for refusing to let me die when it would have been easier, for insisting that we all deserved a chance. The Texas sky deepened to purple and indigo, stars beginning to emerge like promises. The drought would eventually end, the ranch would slowly recover. And three people who had been strangers brought together by desperation would build something neither could have created alone. A family forged not by blood, but by the radical decision to choose each other when every rational calculation said not to. Sometimes the greatest act of faith isn't believing in divine intervention. It's believing that human compassion, even when it defies all logic and self-interest, is worth the risk of everything.